Now, on to our next Flash Talk, the consequences of erasure, hosted by Women's Foundation California. The misrepresentation of Latinx people has posed many problems and resulted in devastating consequences, from stereotypes to violence. Erasure is a different reality that some community members face, whether it be denial of their Latinidad, convenient isolation, or exclusion or purposeful rewriting of history related to Latinx people. This talk will shed light on some of these dynamics and the cost of erasure to the Latinx community. So now please welcome to the stage the Vice President and the Executive Editor of One World, Elizabeth Mendez Berry.
Big round of applause.
Bueno, sí.
Hi, everybody. It's so good to be here. Wow, these lights are so bright. Almost as brilliant as you all are. It's such a pleasure to be here. I really, really appreciate the opportunity to chat. And I think that maybe the reason that I'm here talking about erasure is because I work for the publishing company that has been most targeted by the right wing during their efforts to ban books around the country. If you have followed the targeting of the 1619 Project, for example, you might know that there's specific legislation in multiple states around the country isolating and targeting that book and penalizing educators who try and include it on their curricula. So that's where I work. Hi. I wanted to get this conversation started. First of all, appreciate all of you who are inside with me at a time when there's a lot of delicious snacks outside. I wanted to start by talking about the idea of what erasure means and the impact that it has on all of us. Erasure, I think, has a political component and a cultural component. And one of the things that I've observed over my years, I've had a checkered path, a checkered career, started as a music critic, became a reporter, was an editor, worked in philanthropy to pay the bills, and ultimately am now working in publishing. Publishing is the place where the American archive is formed, right? It's the place where we decide whose stories matter and whose stories are worthy of being included in the collective memory. That's a big responsibility, and those of us who work in publishing know that we're not taking it as seriously as we should. The erasure I mentioned applies not just in the political sphere, but it also applies in spaces like mine. When I started working at One World Books 2.5 years ago, I was the first and only Latina on that team, a team of hundreds and hundreds of editors. I was shocked by that. I couldn't believe it. I kept asking questions. I was like, but wait, there must be a whole squad of Latinas that I don't know about, or not even Latinas, Latinx people, period. And there weren't. So for the purposes of this conversation, I wanted to start with an anecdote that for me crystallizes the connection between political erasure and cultural erasure. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as being the infrastructure of erasure, what it takes to sustain it, and then what I see as the antidote. So hopefully, despite the fact that this is a slightly down conversation, you'll walk out of here with a sense of buoyancy and possibilities. About 10 years ago, I was part of a group of artists and writers who went to Arizona after SB 1070 had passed. We went there to better understand the organizing and mobilization that was happening in Arizona, and also to get a feel for the political context that was preventing people from exercising their rights. While we were there, we saw things that illuminated what I see as being the most devastating examples of erasure. We went to a courthouse where we witnessed a group of about 6 young indigenous men from Central America who did not speak Spanish being tried and deported without legal representation or translation. Erasure. And second of all, we went to the morgue where we saw multiple bodies of people who had died trying to cross the border. Those people's names were not known. They were Jane Does, Juan Does, and there were the numbers exceeded any awareness that I had had previously. Something else we learned while we were there that surprised me is the fact that Arizona was simultaneously shutting down the ethnic studies program. Why would they do that? At the same time as they were launching their Show Us Your Papers law, they were also trying to eliminate the storytelling of Mexican American communities primarily. Arizona Republicans understood the relationship between cultural power and political power. They understood that when Latinx people know our stories and are able to tell them on our own terms, we are powerful. And as a result, they did everything they could to eliminate that power. On the other hand, I guess the glimmer in that story is that Latinx organizers wound up becoming mobilized as a result of the SB 1070 example and did incredible work that actually, in many ways, led to Trump's loss in the last presidential election. So as Harvey just said in the previous conversation, they, in one way, took the power of the Mexican American community in Arizona, but the Mexican American community in Arizona did not allow them to take their power. I think that's important to say, and I think the other thing that I wanted to mention to you all in this conversation is a fundamental principle of my life, which is some of you know me, I've spent a lot of time trying to convince people in the political sphere that culture matters, that you should invest in culture, that you should invest in storytelling, and that if you don't, you're in danger of losing political power, as well as losing a good time, because culture is much more interesting than politics generally. And so what I would say to you, if you remember anything of what I say today, is we have to understand culture as a space of contestation. We have to contest culture. And when we contest culture, and when we understand the power of storytelling to build power, we're actually setting ourselves up not just for transactional political wins, but actually transformational power. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about erasure as it plays out in the world that I operate within, because I thought it would be helpful to give you a little bit of a snapshot of that. I hope that's useful. The infrastructure that enables white liberals to control the publishing industry and prevent all kinds of Latinos, especially Indigenous and Afro-Latinos, from having a voice is not just the obvious, their positions of leadership on the board and at every level, but it's also soft power. It's the group chat, it's the cocktail party, it's all these spaces where people who are not part of a moneyed elite don't have access. As a result, the stories that get published are incredibly narrow, and to the extent that Latinx voices are heard, they are heard in a very narrow context. Latinx voices are erased, except when they're focused on their own trauma, I would say, but not when they are actually offering analysis and perspective on the broader American story, which, of course, we have lots to say about, right? Would you agree? Yeah. So I think all of that, from my perspective, is a reason to think about what we can do collectively and how we can understand ending that erasure, celebrating ourselves, and making structural interventions as well as specific ones. So I want to say that at the start of my checkered career, as I mentioned, I worked for a place called Vibe magazine. And working at Vibe was really important for me because Vibe was led by Black editors, Latinx editors, Black Latinx editors, and it was a place of excellence. And one of the things that I learned very early on as a writer and as an editor was that excellence is not monopolized by white institutions. And that belief gave me a healthy level of arrogance that has informed all of my work since then. As a result, when I see erasure of our communities in all of these different spaces, I'm not going to give you all the data. I think many of you know it. You know that just 1% of philanthropic dollars go to Latinx communities. You may know, the stats on Hollywood. Representative Castro has done a lot of work on these issues. Look at that data and get enraged by it, but don't allow yourself to be paralyzed by it. For me, when I look at it for too long, I can't see a way forward. And so what I do instead is I recall all of the interventions and disruptions that I've witnessed in my life, and that some of which I've participated in, which have demonstrated to me that even as we as a community have been erased in so many devastating ways, again, literally and metaphorically, we have also resisted. And we have resisted effectively, powerfully. We've resisted since the beginning, right? I don't know if you all heard the panel from the journalists a little bit earlier, but I was so moved to hear about their experiences, to hear about the death threats that they're encountering as they try and tell our stories. And also to hear about the struggle they face because they want to tell a full story, not a sanitized story about who we are, right? I think that's incredibly important. You don't want to, from my perspective, you don't want to replace Erasure with a fake, beautiful story about who we are that doesn't grapple with the realities of racism, classism, patriarchy, all of those things that we have to deal with, right? And I would argue that part of the reason that we've been struggling in terms of how we define ourselves as a community is that we have no space to do it in, right? We don't have, as somebody said earlier, we don't have a single Latinx columnist at least in the New York Times at this point. That means that we don't have the opportunity to set the agenda, to have a real conversation about a lot of the different issues that we have to. And so I just want to remind myself all the time of the importance of spaces like the Vibe magazines of today, and also the Spanish language investigative reporting of the past. You all may know that when Mexicans were lynched in Texas, who was reporting on that story? Does anybody know who was reporting on that story? Spanish language newspapers. They were investigating it, and they were uncovering it, and they were holding the state accountable, right? Knowing that history, first of all, knowing the history of the lynchings, but also understanding the infrastructure that is required for us to know about them, right? We won't know about them if we don't have those reporters. So I want to encourage you to think about the antidote, right? The antidote, in my opinion, is, of course, structural change in all of these spaces, in entertainment, in publishing, and all of that. But it's also seeing ourselves and each other and not depending upon those institutions to change for us to find our power, right? And so, for example, like I said, the vibes of the world for me were incredibly important. Now I work for One World. One World is an imprint of Penguin Random House, and One World is Black-led. It is an institution that has played an incredibly important role in supporting all kinds of communities, not just Latinx communities, but it understands the American story in a richer and more complex way. And it includes, among the books that we've published, which I wish we could see outside, and I apologize for the fact that they're not there today, but The Undocumented Americans by Carla Cornejo Villavicencio, who is like a punk rock icon of investigative reporting. Chiara Alegría Udes's My Broken Language. Cali Fajardo Anstein, who's actually from Colorado, who writes the story of indigenous identified Chicanos from the 19th century, here, right? So I want to leave you with a couple of the things that inspire me now, and I want to encourage you all to think about, where have you felt seen? What is the antidote of erasure in your life? What sustains you? What nourishes you? What inspires you? For me, one of those antidotes is Guadalupe Rosales, who does the Veteranas and Rucas Instagram account, which is just a beautiful celebration of Chicana Los Angeles that keeps on giving, because it doesn't just create images of these incandescent women in their prime, but it creates a community of conversation and reminiscences around that. I think, from my perspective, 3 things that you can do moving forward if you want to contest erasure. 1, campaigns. If you have a political bone in your body and you understand these issues, think about arts organizations, media organizations. Think of them as targets, please. Think of us as targets. Because until we get held accountable for the degree to which we have erased Latinx communities broadly and then specifically, we will continue to do it, right? Those of us who are inside these institutions are doing the best we can, but it's not easy. Second, I think, celebrate people who are off-roading and creating culture on their own terms for their own communities. enjoy. Who are those people? Who are those journalists that you heard earlier? Who are the Hollywood folks who are doing such powerful work? Remember who they are, see their work, celebrate it. One of the things that really hit me, and then the third thing is create. Be a creator yourself, right? Create your own voice, your own community, create your own book club. You know, all of those things are ways that you disrupt the hegemony or the monologue of, I would say, white supremacy in this society. One of the things that I've been really sitting with and struggling with, and sort of my call to action, is to do what I can as an editor to publish books that wouldn't otherwise be published. And I thought a lot about this because I realized that you don't have to ban books that never get published. And that's the story of publishing in America. The majority of publishing in America is not publishing our voices, our stories, right? And so my job as a person who's in publishing is to try and push those ideas forward, those stories forward. But I want to encourage all of you to think about how you can hear your own voices, how you can disrupt these ideas about culture, and how you can feel seen and see other people. Because I think ultimately that is taking the power back. Thank you.